Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk at the square root and the cube root graphs, but we're going to add some reflections to them. So there can be two possible places that negatives can be added. You can have a negative completely out front of the radical sign, and you can have one in front of the x under the radical sign. So what they do is they reflect either over the x-axis or the y-axis or in that direction. So let's look at them one at a time, and then we'll do them together. So if the, actually, let's look at this one first, sorry. If the negative is completely out front, what I want to do is I want to focus on that critical point first of all. So this critical point is still going to be at 0, 0. And I'm going to draw with a dash line the original graph. So there's the original square root of x without any reflections, as though it didn't have that negative there. So if there's a negative, what we're going to do is we are simply going to take it and we're going to flip it downward over the x-axis. So this graph, this final graph, is just simply reflected. It's as though I took my piece of paper and I folded it over that critical point. And if I were to lay this on top of that, can you see how this line would lay on top of that green line? So they would if this were done in ink or sorry, in paint or something, it would stick to there. So that is just simply, if there's a negative sign out front, it reflects it downward, okay? If there's a negative sign under the radical sign, so here the negative sign is under the radical sign, that's gonna flip it over the y-axis. So this is still centered at 0, 0, so here's your original graph, right? Without the negative. And then if I were to simply reflect it, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna simply reflect it backwards. Again, as though I took my piece of paper and I folded it along that critical point. And if I were to fold it and flip it over like that, can you see how that's going to lay on top of that? So that's when the negative's under the radical sign. And then what we can do is we can have both situations. So again, centered at 0, 0. Here's the original graph. I think it helps to do each reflection separately. So I'm going to do this first one in pink. So that is still going to be a dotted line. It's still not my final graph. And then my final one will be done in green. So I'm going to take that pink line now, and I'm going to reflect that. And that is my final graph. So what I did was this first negative told me to flip it down over the x-axis. And then this negative sign under the radical sign told me to flip it over the y-axis. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to introduce, moving that critical point, just like we did in the last video. So I'm going to recommend for my class that you guys, you should identify what that critical point is, and don't pay attention to the negative signs at first. So let's ignore the negative sign. So opposite and same. So opposite of positive 2 is negative 2, and there's nothing out here, so that's negative 2, 0. So negative 2, 0 is right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw my original graph. I'm just going to dash it. So that's my original graph. And now what I want to do is I'm going to reflect it. So I'm going to reflect it. So if it's all the way out front, it tells me to reflect it down. Okay, so that's the final graph. Okay, let's look at a different critical point. So this critical point, again, ignoring the negatives, there's nothing right after that x. So that's 0, 3. So 0, 3. Opposite and same, remember that from the last video. So 0, 3 is right here. So I'm going to dash my original graph. And then this negative out front tells me to reflect it downward. So still starting at that critical point, I'm simply going to reflect it downward, as though I'm folding my paper along an imaginary axis, actually, kind of over that critical point and flipping it down. So just go. I think see why it really helps to draw the original graph and then reflect it. So this next one has two reflections. So first, I'm going to pause for a second. I want you to tell me, or you think for a second, what is your vertex, or where's your critical point? What's the opposite and same? What are you taking the opposite of and same of? So opposite and same. Hopefully you got 0, 2. So there's nothing next to that x, so 0, so opposite and same, 0, 2. So 0, 2 is right here. And I'm going to draw my original graph without any of the reflections, so that's my original, and I'm going to do one at a time. I like to do the one out front first, so I'm going to reflect it down. And then the one under the radical tells me to reflect it back. If you can think of it like that, this is kind of down and this is backwards. So down and back. So this green graph is your final graph. This is the final graph right here. Okay, so a couple more things. So then we can also do the same thing to the cube root graph. So the cube root graph, so again, let's not pay attention to the negatives. What is my vertex? Opposite and same, or not my vertex, my critical point. My opposite and same. Think of it for a second. What are you taking the opposite of and what's the same? So hopefully you got -2, 0. So -2, 0 is right here. So I'm going to dash my cube root graph. Remember, the cube root one is the one that goes forward and backwards. So that's my cube root graph. And now this, so I want to think of this as two separate pieces. I think of the cube root graph as like, it's kind of a square root graph with a tail. So they're two separate pieces. And I like to handle them separately. So I'm going to just do this first. I'm going to reflect this first piece. So this tells me to reflect it down, right? It's outside of the radical sign. So I'm going to reflect that first piece down. So if I reflect this down, what do you think I'm going to do to this piece? Well, that piece is actually going to go up this way, right? Because what I want to do is I want to be able to, you know, have this imaginary line where I'm folding this, and I'm taking this purple graph and I'm reflecting it over that imaginary fold there. Okay, let's do two more. So what is your vertex, or your critical point, first of all? Opposite and same. So opposite of something that's there, which is nothing. So 0, 3. So 0, 3, 1, 2, 3 is right here. I'm going to draw my cube root graph, which is here. That's my cube root graph, right? This tells me to reflect it back, right? So I am going to take this in individual pieces. So instead of going down, I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to go backwards, right? So I'm going to go back. And then if that's what I'm doing to that, what do you think I'm going to do to this piece? Well, that one's going to go like that. Okay, so think about that for a second. This negative under the radical, if it's under the radical, it tells me to take this piece right here and go backwards. So instead of going this way, I'm going, you know, think of it, I'm folding it, I'm reflecting it over this line right here, this imaginary crease. Oops, there's my imaginary crease. So if I were to fold it, see how it would line up? So this purple graph would lay on top of that green graph. Okay. And one more. So now, what's my critical point? So opposite and same, there's nothing after that x, so it's going to be 0, -1, opposite and same. So 0, -1 is right here. And my cube root graph looks like this. Right? That's my cube root graph. So I'm going to do one reflection at a time. This, and watch what happens with this. So with the cube root graph, this is the only one that this happens to. With the cube root graph, I'm going to reflect this first negative, this one. I'm going to do that first. So this I'm going to reflect this way. And look what happens now with my pink one. So all I've done with the green, I've just done this, the first negative out front, right? I just reflected it down. So I reflected it down. And this pink one now, look what happens when I do the pink one. So now what I want to do is the pink one tells me to reflect it backwards. So if I just look at this one tail right here and I go backwards, look what happens. I'm going to lay right there. And this, if I reflect that backwards, I'm going to lay right there. So this is the only graph that this happens to happen to, but on the cube root graph, if you have both negatives, you actually end up with your original. They kind of cancel each other out. That is the only time that happens, though. It's only with the cube root, not with the square root graph. And then on your homework, I just wanted to cover, there was one more thing you needed to do, and that was to come up with the equation of the line, or the equation of the graph. So first of all, if I look at this, I know that it starts off with y equals, and I know it's the square root of x graphs in some fashion, right? It only has one tail, it doesn't have both. So I know it's the square root of x. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify my vertex. So this is 2, 1. So opposite and same. Opposite of positive 2 is minus 2, and same as 1, right? So opposite and same. But there is a reflection going on here, right? It's not the regular square root graph. So the regular square root graph would kind of go off this way, right? But this has been reflected down. So you have to think for a second. Is the negative going to be all the way out front, or is it going to be in here next to the x? So if all I did was I reflected it down, which one told us to go down? And hopefully you thought to yourself, ha, it's the one all the way out front. So there you go. So that's the equation of that graph. So you will have a few of those to do on your homework, and I believe on the test as well. Hey, good luck on your homework.